Welcome to the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talk and this 8th and last session in this special series on Vashon 101. Your microphones are not muted this evening, and we can mute you throughout the series. So you'll be muted and not muted, or you could mute yourself. Otherwise, please have your microphone, have them muted during the talk. We will have breakout sessions, and of course you can unmute yourselves then. This is a wrap-up session in the series facilitated by Dr. Patrick Christie. We will be talking about improving Vashon through exploring connections. And the next slide. I'm Elsa Kroonquist, the Executive Director of the Vashon Heritage Museum, and I'd like to start the evening by recognizing some of our sponsors of our history talks and say thank you to For Culture and Humanities Washington, who made this possible, and of course, and to all of the speakers who have presented throughout this 8-part series and who are here this evening to help facilitate this discussion. Also, this talk and almost all of our talks are recorded and can be found about a week after the presentation on the Vashon Heritage Museum website. And now at this time, Chris Austin, a Vashon Heritage Museum board member, will read the land acknowledgement statement. Chris?
Thank you, Elsa. The Vashon Heritage Museum stands on the ancestral lands of the Shobops, or Swiftwater people, who inhabited Vashon Maury Island for millennia. The Donation Land Claim Act encouraged large numbers of settlers to claim land even before the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 extinguished native claims to it. The Shobops were imprisoned on Fox Island during the Puget Sound Treaty Wars by the territorial government and later relocated onto the Puyallup Reservation. We acknowledge the people of the Puyallup tribe whose stewardship of and relationship with Vashon Maury Island continues today. We commit to amplify the voices of Indigenous people, making space for them to tell their own story, both past and present, in our exhibits and programs. Thank you, Elsa.
Now our inclusion pledge. The Vashon Maury Island Heritage Museum rejects racism, discrimination, and hate. Our purpose is to honor stories of love, oppression, action, and resilience. Stories that give voice to all, examine hard questions about social, economic, and environmental justice, and reveal racism and oppression within our heritage. We pledge that everything we do will honor the island's diversity of cultures and histories. Tonight's speaker, Patrick Christie, has lived on Vashon since 2021. He was trained as both an aquatic biologist and sociologist at the University of Wisconsin and University of Michigan. He is a professor at the University of Washington, where he studies and teaches about how people relate to oceans and how we can best organize society to improve sustainability. Welcome, Patrick, and I will ask you to take it away.
Okay, I realize now that I need to update my picture. More gray hair. So I'm going to do a couple introductory remarks and introduce the questions that we're going to use for discussion, and then make some summative remarks about the various presentations that we had at Vashon 101. So as you can see from this slide, the series covers a wide variety of topics. And, most notably, we were honored during the course with 2 Indigenous teachers who offered us a deeper understanding of this place we call Vashon and Maury Island and the surrounding areas. I think it's important, as I've always said during the class, to acknowledge that land acknowledgements are, in a sense, insufficient. It's important to recognize the presence of Indigenous peoples in their histories, but also it's important to express our commitments to positive change, which is what I think is inspiration for today's discussion. The focus of the final session will be on what we've learned through the course of these talks and key themes that cut across the various talks, and how we can take that information to improve our community, to make it more sustainable, more inclusive, more anti-racist, and to be aware of how to use our privilege in interesting and empowering ways. I'm going to ask you to admit people as they come in because I won't be. Okay, thank you. And so there are 3 guiding questions that were sent out in an email, and you'll see them in a little bit. Well, actually, why don't I just share my screen, and they're embedded there. This will stop others sharing screen. Do you? Yeah, I'm going to continue, and then I'm going to continue. Okay. Okay. All right. Are you able to see my screen with the questions?
Yes.
So these are the 3 questions that were sent out and were developed with Elsa and Bruce. What emerged from Vashon 101 that suggests what we can do to improve the social and environmental justice on Vashon? What steps can we take to make these improvements? What organizations and people to involve? And what specifically can we do to improve relations with the Puyallup tribe and other tribal institutions like the Seattle Indian Health Board and others? We're focused on the final question on Puyallup and other indigenous groups, particularly because we had 2 indigenous speakers, but it's not meant to be exclusive of other social groups on the island. Okay, yeah, do this here, sorry. 1 second here. Are you seeing the multiple screens, or are you seeing the 1 slide now? I'm sorry.
We're seeing the whole multiple.
You're seeing the multiples. Once, let me hear. I gotta change this here. Sorry about that. I gotta switch this up here. Well, you'll have to bear, I'm gonna actually do it like this because I have 2 monitors, and apparently when I made a choice before, it's now stuck with this choice. So I hope it's not too much of a problem. So these are the 3 questions for our discussions. And I want to start with a little bit of social theory. I wanted to present something from my training and how I teach around these issues at the university. And I wanted to start with some well-known social theory surrounding worldviews. And I'm breaking my first rule for my students in that I don't let them use Wikipedia for anything in their term papers, but Wikipedia can serve to help with definitions. And are you seeing the definition of worldview now on your screen? No.
You're not sharing anymore.
Okay, sorry. Jeez, it's like I don't teach anymore. Let's see. Sorry. Yeah. Now you should see it, right?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. So this is a definition pulled from Wikipedia about what is a worldview. It's a term we use commonly in society, but on Wikipedia, they say that a worldview is a fundamental cognitive orientation of an individual or society encompassing the whole of the individual or society's knowledge and point of view. And according to Lind, who's written extensively about this, a worldview is more or less a coherent understanding of the nature of reality, which permits its holders to interpret new information in light of their preconceptions. Clashes among worldviews cannot be ended by a simple appeal to facts. Even if rival sides agree on the facts, people may disagree on conclusions because of their different premises. This is why politicians often seem to talk past one another or ascribe different meanings to the same events. Yeah, boy, doesn't that resonate with us today. Now, how does this notion of a worldview affect our perceptions of the environment and our advocacy for particular policies around the environment? Much of what I think of some of the best social theory was actually developed in the 60s. And this is from a classic book, The Social Construction of Reality by Berger and Luckman. And it's a bit dense and they use a lot of sociologic jargon here, but I'll work us through this here. So they state reality is socially constructed. and the sociology of knowledge must analyze the processes in which this occurs. It will be enough to define reality as a quality appertaining to phenomena that we recognize as being independent of our own volition. We cannot wish them away. And to define knowledge as the certainty that phenomena are real and that they possess specific characteristics. So let me break this down a little bit, what they were talking about. Berger and Luckman say sociologic interest in questions of reality and knowledge is thus initially justified by the fact of their social relativity. And I think this following statement helps us understand this a little bit. What is real to a Tibetan monk may not be real to an American businessman. It follows that specific agglomerations of reality and knowledge pertain to specific social contexts. They also say in Berger and Luckman that no human thought is immune to ideologizing influences of its social context. They also suggest in this book that subjective meanings become, in many people's minds, objective facticities. So what they're basically saying is this, is that we have reality, you can't just wish it away, but we create knowledge about that reality, and that is somehow influenced by who we are and where we come from. They also suggest that there's a notion of ideology, which is this idea that my beliefs about my knowledge about reality are the correct ones. And we begin to believe that our ideological beliefs of the world are factual or facticities. I love how sociologists make up words. So some of the key concepts of this is that a worldview is a shared opinion or belief. It's influenced by your education, your class, your gender, your family of origin. And our worldview is coded in the language we use, our policies, our religions. And it can easily be translated into so-called truths or the right attitude. Now, what's of course really important to realize is that ideology has a strong history, right? Many people believe that Jews and Blacks were inferior people, and we know what became of that. Now, you may think that it's a long stretch to think about this in regards to the environment, but I can't tell you the number of times during an interview that people say, well, my understanding of the environment is the correct one, or my way of managing the environment is the right one. And if people just got awoken to my understanding of the environment, they would see the idiocy of their actions. And they aren't in touch with their own worldview to realize that their conceptualization of the environment and environmental policies is simply a manifestation of their own personal worldview, which is derivative of who they are, their race, their gender, their class, their education, etc. And I think the most progressive way to understand this is that nature is actually a text, like a book that's read, it's interpreted. It's a human construct that is influenced by our personal worldview. It's not to deny the existence of a coral reef or a tree. It's just to say that the meaning of those depend on who you are. This is a particularly good read. Philip Steinberg is a geographer at the University of Florida. I like this one in particular, using my class, The Social Construction of the Ocean. And Steinberg maintains that the ocean itself is a social construct with different meanings and the importance depending on who you are. I always tell my students, if you jump into the ocean, you will get wet. So it is real. But the meaning and value of the ocean is influenced by your background and your knowledge system. The same could be said about trees or salmon. One of the things I always do when I teach class at the University of Washington called Society in the Oceans, it's usually between 150 and 250 students. I have them take a social survey developed by Thomas Gladwin, a social psychologist out of the University of Michigan. And I hope you can see this, but basically students take a questionnaire, about 20 questions, ask them questions like, do you think there are too many people in the world or too few people in the world? Do you think that all things are connected or things are discrete? And then they score themselves and plot themselves on this 4x4 graph. And at the top here, and I hope you can see my pointer, you have Malthusian at the top and cornucopian on the bottom. This axis, the y-axis, is resources and how abundant they are and how important population is in your construction of the world and the environment, and whether resources are super abundant or are scarce and getting more and more scarce depending on how many people are in the world. On the x-axis, you have on the left mechanists and on the right holists. And this has to do with how you think of knowledge of the environment in particular. Are you a person who likes to discretely compartmentalize nature and break it apart into discrete pieces, or are you a holistic thinker? So you can see data from 4 different years here, and I always ask the students to interpret their own selves. And what you can see here is the dots get bigger, the number of people, and you can see a very clear trend here. One is that the vast majority of people who study the environment and want to be environmentalists at the University of Washington are Malthusian and holistic thinkers, meaning that they're hyper concerned about population and the destruction of the environment and the loss of resources. And they're holistic in their thinking. And this is partly derivative of how they're educated. It's also sampling bias, according to, like a sociologist would say, the kinds of students who take my classes are environmentalist types. But what you also see in these data are that there's a spread. And I always have to remind myself and the fellow students in the class that there are people in the room who are engineers and they're mechanists, and they don't trust holistic thinkers. They think it's loosey-goosey. Or you have business school students who think, you know, resources are super abundant, more babies, more geniuses, more solutions. So this is an important thing, and it's a demonstration of the fact that if you're, and I also remind my students, if you want to be effective in the environmental realm, you have to realize that you have an internalized worldview. You can either choose to try to impose that on people or use your position to understand other people's worldviews. And I would suggest become a more effective practitioner, which I think is very relevant for Vashon and what we learned during the class. So now I'm going to start to go on the summation of the talks. So I talked to the various speakers in Vashon 101, and I asked them to provide me a take-home message from their class. And then I tried to link these together a bit in this presentation. I'm going to now try to do my best and represent what they had to tell me about their take-home messages in relation to the themes of sustainability and equity. I'm not going to tell them what they thought in terms of solutions, because I thought it would be better if we co-generate those as a class. So Steve Bergman is with us today, and Steve had to say, and I'm going to read these verbatim because I don't want to be doing violence to people's presentations. We live on a dynamic, evolving landscape above a plate boundary at the mercy of plate tectonic processes, with earthquakes, nearby volcanoes, landslides, tsunami, and other hazards. We need to understand these hazards and mitigate risks and vulnerabilities. We have, and as you see in this slide, a single source complex aquifer system. And instead of polluting our environment and extracting water resources, also used by other ecosystem elements, we should repair past damage and institute practices that ensure resilience in the face of the climate crisis. Our impact on the planet has changed its natural course, and we now need to correct for these impacts by healing the earth, or future generations will suffer the consequences. We don't need to save the planet. It will survive without us, yet we might save ourselves if we act. So thank you, Steve, for those remarks. Tom DeVries said, my talk dealt with matters geologic and climatic, and deliberately avoided matters related to human occupation of the Pacific Northwest, other than to give an entry point for those interested in pursuing a long view of the human presence. One could say the history of humans in the Pacific Northwest, and really anywhere in the world, has been a story of resilience in the face of changing ecological and social circumstances. This observation leads to the question, will that resilience continue when the Earth is occupied by 8 or 10 billion people? I would say yes. That's Tom talking. But this answer then bears on what is really meant by the term sustainable. If at any time or place human activity has changed the landscape, or if natural forces have changed the landscape, then from the perspective of an earlier generation, prior measures of sustainability are no longer being realized. Thus, resilience means changing to survive the new circumstances. As much of our present environment may change due to the actions of 8 or 10 billion people. Some by design or by luck will survive. That's resilience despite unsustainability. But is that what we want? Or is it too arrogant to even imagine that what the entirety of the human race wants is achievable? For millennia, people have lived with what's possible in the moment, not with what they want. Another way of describing resilience. He concludes by saying this is a pessimistic view of humanity's future, perhaps, but arguably the most accurate according to the experience of the majority of billions of people alive today. Our rose-colored optimism and dreams of sustainability only conceits of affluent members of a privileged class. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to just conclude, and I failed to do this with Steve, and I'm going to do that now, but I'm going to, and then with Tom. First of all, I wanted to just pleasantly say, first off, Steve, you helped me really become more fascinated with our island. Who doesn't want to be at the beach, look at your feet, and begin to understand what kind of rocks we're looking at and their histories? That was really wonderful. And we live in a place that's always changing and has disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis. And one of the questions that came to my mind when I heard you speak and reviewed all these talks was, are some social groups more vulnerable than others to these disasters? And if so, is this something that should be and can be addressed? And some remarks I had in relation to Tom's talk were, while we are understandably concerned about the present and the future, what are the consequences of taking a pessimistic or overly optimistic view when we consider what we can do today to take action to solve issues of sustainability and equity on Vashon? Also, what are the implications of framing the underpinning issue as one of overpopulation as the cause of the problems we witness? Does that framing close or open options? Is it the only driver we need to consider? So now our next talk was by Bina McLeod, and this is some pictures from the gathering we had at my house with Bina, who's a Puyallup member, and it was very generous, Bina, of you coming here to Vashon, even when you were not feeling all that great. We had a nice dinner and we walked around on Puyallup land across the street on 240th, and some individuals on the island gifted you things from their organizations and even gave you a little care package for traveling on the ferry. People were honored by your presence and we shared food together, and it was a really wonderful gathering. Bina describes herself as the daughter of Janet, an activist, and Don McLeod, a fisherman, and she described herself as a child of the movement. Bina and I had a conversation in which she told the story of the fish wars of the 60s and 70s that led to the rightful place of tribes as formal co-managers of Puget Sound. She told the story of violence against Indigenous peoples and their resistance and ultimate success. She then told us about Chief Leshai Schools, where she is the Director of Culture and Student Success. She instills in their Indigenous students, quote, "We are nature, we are science." Their curriculum centers Indigenous culture, language, and sustainability. And she encouraged us on Vashon to teach the whole and truthful history of what actually happened here on the island. In conclusion, she said, Vashon should keep the focus on sustainability. She's impressed by the local focus on agriculture and sustainability. She encourages us to eat locally, including venison and local foods. Native people didn't hunt for trophy, they hunted for food. Take what you need only. She wants us to build bridges between the Puyallup tribe and Vashon residents, especially with the youth. And then Bianca Perla, in remarks to Bina's presentation, here are some thoughts that I had. I appreciated the frank presentation of her and other Coast Salish people's experiences. It's tragic. There's no other word. And in many contexts, racism continues to undermine our society. I wonder, how is it possible that Bina McLeod and other Puyallup members and leaders, despite all they have endured, remain open to working with us, non-Native people, to form coalitions, to solve problems, and create a better future? What does that generosity of spirit mean for us? And what needs to be done? And then Bianca, she said to me recently, we have huge environmental challenges created by the same social forces that created social inequities. We need everyone at the table. There's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that can be used alongside science. Environmental and social justice are linked. We need to look outside Western views. The same thing, and this is notable, the same thing that oppressed people oppress the animals and trees. Climate change is a local and global issue. It's complex. There were controlled burns in the past. We need to understand the fire cycle. And regarding salmon, harvesting practices by the tribes are being looked at again. Harvesting of salmon at the source or the run by run at the river mouths, indigenous reef netting that caught one salmon species at a time. There was an oppression of this reef netting fishing technique. Now there's only one indigenous holder of such a reef net permit. And as for herring, we see at Jensen Point, shell midden, how important herring were for thousands of years despite considerable harvests. And now those herring are collapsing. So in relation to Bianca's presentation, I'm really impressed that she's speaking about the integration of science and traditional ecological knowledge as a formally trained scientist. That to acknowledge the value of such traditional ecological knowledge does not undermine our respect for science. What does it mean for Vashon organizations like the Vashon Nature Center, the Land Trust, or even organizations like the Vashon Zero Waste that engages in waste management on the island to integrate these knowledge forms? And how important is it that traditional ecological knowledge is embedded in the ethos of sustainability and right relations between humans and non-humans? And what are the challenges of melding traditional ecological knowledge and science? And then Brandon Raynon, who's also a Puyallup tribal member, honored us with his presence in Vashon 101. He showed us some very powerful videos about Puyallup history and culture and contemporary life. He laid out the history of this context, making it clear how indigenous life and culture were violently impacted by settler colonialism, how land was stolen, how indigenous people were forced to reservations, and then how that reservation land was taken through nefarious policies and actions. And he highlighted how the Puyallup people are resilient and their culture is vibrant today. As you can see from these slides here, it's notable that Puyallup people, their naming itself and were well known as the generous and welcoming behavior to all people who enter our lands, which inspired my earlier comments about the generosity of Bina and Brandon to come and teach us in Vashon 101. And then, of course, this person, Lucy Durand, and her comments about Indigenous people on Vashon Island, 10 large longhouses. And Brandon reminded us that the estimates of the population of Indigenous peoples here is greater than they currently are today. And just imagine that, people living in sustainable relation with this environment, even at higher population levels. How is that possible? It's really fascinating. And then Bruce Hallman, our favorite historian on the island, seated in front of his massive library, although I think it's a digital library. And he had laid out to us various epochs that are going to inform the new Vashon Heritage Museum. And Bruce stated to me, Vashon has always been an inequitable place, a place of white privilege since settlement by Euro-Americans. This has impacted how people treat the land and sea and resources, and the settler mentality is distinct from how Native Americans treated the land and sea. Bruce gets the award for being succinct. It's surprising as a historian, but good job, Bruce. And so you can see here the various epochs that he laying out for the museum: geology and natural history gallery, arrival of humans, the contact period of Euro-Americans with Indigenous peoples, modernization on the island, the World War II era, and then the current era of gentrification on the island. And then Alice, my thoughts about Bruce, some closing remarks in here are, how we treat one another impacts how we treat the environment. Should we still consider ourselves to be the settler? Why or why not? And if so, how does that framing affect our behavior? And how does it affect our relations with Indigenous peoples, the island, and one another? And if so, how does that influence our ideas about sustainability, equity, and education? This isn't a term that we go around, offering, oh, you're a settler, but I was recently at a talk by some Indigenous people at the Longhouse at UW campus, and they said the settlement of this region is only just begun. And in fact, we are in the midst of the settlement era. And then Alice said the following. She presented a picture of who we are today economically and demographically. On the island, we have the haves and the have-nots. She wants us to consider various scenarios. One in which is like becoming like Martha's Vineyard, where people are brought to the island to work for wealthy people and then leave at the end of the day. She maintains that Vashon is moving in that direction. If you move here today, you have to have significant money to buy a house, afford the ferry, etc. Some who are already here and established are fortunate. And current regulations prevent subdivision of the land, affecting how many can move here. We are having problems finding housing for teachers or workers at the grocery stores. We need to find solutions for the middle and lower income people on the island. She also pointed out that there's a growing Latino population on the island. And she pointed out it's notable that the island's teaching body doesn't match the change in the student body. And as you see here in 2 slides from her talk, that the Latino population is in fact growing rapidly on the island, and that in fact housing is really a problem, and there are many people on lists to receive affordable housing on the island or have an opportunity to buy a home that's affordable. My thoughts on this talk were, I was really impressed and fascinated by the social and demographic data presented. And I encourage everyone to watch this talk. I wonder if and how these trends are related to the issues of sustainability. For example, are we headed toward another sort of enclave in addition to Martha's Vineyard? Some sort of green utopia for those of us already on the island, one in which our carbon footprint and toxic footprint is exported elsewhere. I'm reminded of what Terry Williams, a recently deceased Tulalip elder, told me on a car ride. He said to me, quote, "You white people are funny. You protect some areas to keep them pristine while you trash everything outside of those precious areas." That's not how we as Native people think of the world and how to reach sustainability. We consume fish, we value them, and try to stay in right relation with them. So here are some concluding remarks from the talks. And these are just my reflections a bit, and I'm sure you might come to different conclusions. And so I don't mean to do violence to anyone's presentations or overstep my role as a teacher. But here are some remarks from Patrick. Society's relations with this place has not been sustainable since colonization by Euro-Americans. It may seem as though it is now, but it's also possible that we're exporting our footprint elsewhere. This has not been a just place. And today, as it gentrifies, there are new issues of injustice that we need to consider. It's clear from the various talks that the chickens are coming home to roost, even on Vashon. The forests are changing, there are water quality issues, temperatures and smoke events are increasing. And it's important to understand that different social groups are more vulnerable than others to these pressures. And how we treat one another, how we treat the water, how we treat one another shapes how we treat the waters, the forest, and the Salish Sea. And we continue to work to improve our relations with Indigenous peoples and other social groups, such as the growing Latino population. But clearly there's room for improvement. I got a distinct sense that there's an appetite to lean in, to create coalitions of people from different backgrounds. And that was from both sides of Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples throughout the presentations. And while there are deep and effective efforts to improving sustainability on Vashon, Bina highlighted some of those, there is still room for improvement in how we consider new types of knowing and new means towards sustainability. So with that, those concluding remarks, I guess we have, I think, about 20 minutes or 20, maybe plus 10 if we go over a little bit. We now have some opportunity. I think it's probably likely that we ought not to go into breakout rooms because I haven't been monitoring on people here. But is it fair to say that we should stay in one group?
I think so, Patrick.
Yeah.
We have about 12 participants beyond the faculty, and if the faculty can constrain themselves, we can hear from the students.
Right. So here are the discussion questions that we had laid out before. And so what to us emerged from the class over the course of the months that suggests what we can do to improve social and environmental justice on the islands, and what steps can we realistically take to make these improvements, and specifically what organizations and people to involve. And in particular, what are some ideas for improving relations with the Puyallup tribe and other tribal institutions like the Seattle Indian Health Board? And so I think the idea is to just take some notes about, what we can do in terms of improvement and actions. And so why don't I stop sharing my screen and I can help facilitate some of the conversation. I guess we could, given that we're a small group and maybe in the spirit of teaching, and I don't mean to make this about my presentation, but are there any, I'm going to take a license here with a little bit with the plan here, are there any clarifying questions or comments about remarks that I made about social theory, about the conclusions, about the presentations during the course of the class? And then we can break into these various questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen. So are there any questions that people had for me as a teacher, not just as a facilitator? And trust me, I won't take offense if there aren't.
Patrick, if I can just jump in and just reinforce, when I was starting graduate school in the dark ages, is when, you know, the Nature of Scientific Revolutions book came out and the Social Construction of Reality book came out. And
Right.
they were powerful influences on my early graduate education. And it's encouraging to see that there's still fundamental texts in terms of understanding the way we perceive the world. And so I just wanted to congratulate you on that. You're making me feel like I'm not as ancient as I am.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I mean, people would call me, I'm pretty close to approaching the elder class here, but I would say, yeah, Thomas Clune's book, Scientific Revolutions, I think is not only essential reading for humanists or social scientists, but for natural scientists. And unfortunately, a lot of natural scientists never are exposed to it. It's really the story of how do we learn, how do scientists with a capital S, natural scientists, understand. He was a physicist, Thomas Kuhn, and he basically said, he analyzed how did you shift from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. And that was a very difficult process where Newtonian physicists said, this guy Einstein is a total nut job. And basically he wrote about the sociology of how certain classes of scientists repress other groups of scientists. And then he basically says that the only way you have scientific revolutions is that when the gatekeepers die and pass on, and then you get these kind of episodic changes in scientific understandings. And then, as I mentioned, Berger and Luckman, this whole idea, which some people would suggest got a little out of control with sort of social relativity and social constructionism, like there's no truth in the world. I don't think that's what Berger and Luckman were saying. I think they're basically saying is that we socially construct our knowledge systems. Reality exists, but what we do with that knowledge and how we come to that knowledge really depends on who you are as a person. And I'll tell you, on the island, so many people, you have conversations about the environment, and they have this it's called a deficit model of education. Like if we could just fill people's brains with knowledge about what the environment is, somehow light bulbs would go on and they'd become the next sustainability guru. I would suggest that that's a very simplistic understanding of education. Education is always dialectical. It's always in dialogue. Bina, what do you have to say?
Well, I'm listening to all of this and about the books and everything. Very good presentation, by the way, Patrick. I enjoyed it. But I think that sometimes that we go so far that way that we forget the simplicity of who we are as human beings. Very simple, you know. And when we talk about the environment and the things of sustainability and stuff like that, you know, I always sum it up, and I always try to get to the human being context of it, because in reality, if my next 7 generations don't have air or water or the things that they need to sustain themselves, neither are yours. And so the perspective becomes, as human beings, how do we save this environment, you know, as a whole? I like how you talked about your pristine area, but your footprint out there is real big, right? And you know, and so Chief Lesha just received an environmental award from the Department of Education on our garden and on our wetlands, you know, and they always have these big conceptions about what it is to save the environment. And I think it just boils down to the footprints that we leave as each human being, right? And I can remember a clan mother telling us at one point, our way of life is so simple that people fail to see it in our connection with the Mother Earth and things like that, you know. And I think that if people can get to the simplicity of what that environment means for our survival, then I think that it it it, it shouldn't be hard to change their mind about where society's going, you know, and the things that we do to destroy our earth, right? So she dies, we die, you know, so I just kind of always want to bring it back to the simplicity of who we are as human beings and the sustainability of what it takes for one human being to survive in society, utilizing the environment around them. You know, like I said, our philosophy is we only take what we need, you know, you know, so when we go hunting, we only take what our family needs for the winter. We go fishing, we learn to preserve it and utilize it for the winter. It was never for sport or recreation for us. And so I just kind of want to put that out there because I think that I would just encourage people to think of the simplicity of who we are as human beings.
Great.
Was that way off base?
No, not at all.
That way out there?
I like it. I like it a lot. Does anyone want to add some other? I mean, we're already beginning to, I would suggest, get into the discussion part of this. So let's maybe shift into that. And so I offered some thoughts. Vina just offered some thoughts about messaging, keeping it simple, understanding the simplicity of the relations that we have, and that it's important to recognize that what happens to the next generations and how we treat the environment affects us and the future generations, and living a sustainable lifestyle by taking what we need and no more. Are there other concepts that people that came forward from Vashon 101 that resonate with you about ways to improve and social and environmental relations on the island? David, my neighbor from down on the beach. You're got to unmute yourself, Dave. Let's see here. Can we unmute him? There. Oh, you were off for a second. Hold on, Dave. You muted yourself. You were off for a millisecond there.
I keep unmuting him at the same time, and so we're double negative. Sorry about that, David. I apologize.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, I've been on the island 50 years, and I must say, I welcome the Swiftwater people. And I want to embrace that welcome and send it out. I remember about 25 years ago, there was an archaeological dig at Jensen Point. And there were artifacts that were found by the Burke Museum. And there was a lot of interest. But after that, nothing. And now I'm seeing signs, the land of the Swiftwater people. One of those signs is on my property. And I'm so proud to have that. What I would like to see is evidence that they were here and they have a story and we welcome them. I would like to see names of places that we all know as Jensen Point. What is their name for that? And for Burton Beach? and other places that we know, let's see what their name is. And that will maybe generate interest in how they lived and what we can learn from them in terms of ecology. So thank you, whoever is involved. I know, Bruce, you've done a lot in terms of recognizing and saying, yes, you were here. Thank you so much for that. Another thing is I used to use the name Shamamish. And I know that's wrong. But if a name could be, and names could be used that we can pronounce, it would be helpful. And so thank all of you for bringing in this possibility. I'll look forward to the future.
Thank you, David. Yeah, and David, by the way, his land is your neighbors, contiguous with the Puyallup land there on the west side, and so literally your neighbors by law. So other remarks following on that? Is there any? Yes, I see Andrea and David.
Yeah, I just had a thought in follow up to those comments, David's, about the, for instance, the Docton Historic Trail that's in my neck of the woods. And I think the thought came to me of going back further. You know, those signs are so informative and so educational. And to pick up on what David said, what if we reimagine them and included what happened, 100, 200 years before that particular event along the Docton Historic Trail? As he said, what was going on there before the Euro-Americans were there? It gives a great summary of what happened since we've been here, but what happened before that? Who was here before that? And we already have that existing, these historic trails, at least the one in Docton, and I know there's one in Ellisport coming. I think there might be another one somewhere under development, but that was just a thought that came to my mind as David was talking about the previous place names and trying to broaden our understanding of the place that is here now.
If I could, that's a great point. And if I can just respond, Andrea, that's happening with the Ellisport Trail and with the Burton Trail that's under development, and with some signs that are going to be at Liza Beulah. And Docton is looking at redoing those signs. That's nearly 20 years old now.
Wow, that's great.
And so and revising those signs and recognizing that history didn't begin when the settlers came.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Thanks, Bruce.
It's also indicative of the changes on the island, isn't it? I mean, it's interesting. This is sort of an incarnate. In fact, it'd be kind of cool to keep the old signs and sort of like as a testimony to, like, the changes on the island. And so I hope you don't just chuck those ones out and replace them like with revisionism. But yeah.
So if you could all envision the beaches of Vashon Island or the beaches of the Puget Sound, with the longhouses, and the story poles that represented the families, so when you walk down to those beaches, imagine these big, beautiful longhouses, a village of longhouses, in which the people lived, because there's no real written history for us, right? We were all oral tradition. And so when you think about that, I can't remember what year it is. I'm going to make a mental note to find out what year that happened, when the army came up and down these beaches here and burnt down all the longhouses. And so one of the thoughts that when I was in college, one of the critical thinking things was, how do you think the people felt as they were watching their longhouses burn? Because they burned them all up and down the coast. They went up and burned them all. And we had to do little replicas. And so I said, well, I recommend that we burn it so that we can find out what those feelings are. And it was almost sacrilegious. They said, no, you're not going to burn it. And if you do, you got to put sage, cedar, you got to pray over it. You know, so those feelings were still just as strong doing the replicas, you know. And so if you can imagine that when you walk to your beaches and imagine what it was like to see longhouses, a village of longhouses living along the beaches in Vashon with canoes in front and you know, our children playing, you know, on those beaches that were their homes one time. And so, you know, the historical perspective for me to share with you would be try to see that when you walk your beaches.
Those are important images. Kim.
So when the Puyallup canoe journey folks were at Jensen Point, on the second day, there was a blessing done. And of course, the person used the name of Jensen Point, which is the big madrona tree that's there, the grandfather tree that's there. And it was just so grounding and so rooting to be in a place and to know that place has just been sacred and special for such a long time. And I think for me, seeing that continuity of children laughing, playing, those canoes coming in, I mean, I just felt just really honored that I could be in such an amazing, special place. But I'm aware that getting that sensation of I don't know, place or home and making it broader than this is my beachfront house that my family has had for the last, you know, 2 generations, and we're not giving up our bulkhead or whatever for salmon. We have to make that kind of transition and take the history of that past and the 21st century realities of the environmental impact that carbon and we have done. And we have to find a way to meld that together so we can heal and we can educate and we can be a community.
Vina, I want to call out something you mentioned during your talk in relation to what Kim just said. I don't know if you recall, but you had an idea at the tail end of your conversation to us about children coming together on the island and trying to foster a way where we could have Puyallup youth on the island. Because I was also, you know, part of the gathering there at Jensen Point recently. And I remember meeting, you know, Patricia Conway Ortiz and others about this and conversation. And it was really remarkable. It was so much fun to see Puyallup youth out there frolicking the water, canoeing around, having a goofball time. You know, most of them said, you know, they'd never been here before and they're having a great time. And so I'm just wondering, like, how does one actualize this connection between people that come from different backgrounds, who maybe your focus being frequently is on young people? Could you know, you threw out some ideas during your talk about sort of summer exchanges, or you used the term camp, I think, but I'm just curious what you think is feasible, doable, and maybe that's something this group can discuss as well.
Well, I think we did have conversations about some actual events that were taking place that, you know, we couldn't make it because our canoe journey was going on, because we take the one up to, we also take our canoe in May, Chief Leshai, and that's why we weren't on this one this year, to San Juan Islands, who kind of have the same kind of thoughts that you guys have. How do we reconnect? How do we make that happen? How do we, you know, and so one of the things that they started to do was just have a little canoe journey, you know, to different islands, and we're hosted by the people there, and we share with the people, and, you know, we have talking circles with the people in the community, and there's only like 5 canoes that travel with us, and we go to each island, and they host us, and we share, you know, and the last place that we stayed there, the gentleman let us camp in his yard, and he was talking about how when he cleared his land, you know, there was like fires had been built there at one point. And this had to have been a place where your people landed, because over here is the oyster bread and the clam bread. Here's a stream that runs up here. and we overlooking the water, and I think that when we did that, it kind of helped, helps them to also remember and give honor to the people that were there prior to them. And they open up their communities, their homes, they feed us, and it's just really a good sharing, and maybe that's just something that we can do, a couple of youth canoes, travel to different spots on Vashon Island, and we share with your children and the people of your community, because it's such a powerful event, them canoes coming back to the shores that they once traveled to numerous times, and the students get to share and see and share their stories with the people of that community. So we do that one every year in May up towards the San Juans, and because we've tried to connect to come to one of your camps or something, but I thought it has to kind of be a time where we can just really share, and if it's just our canoe traveling from different locations on your island and camping in different areas in your communities, that we can come with song and dance and sharing stories, and the community, the little communities in that little area host us. And and then the Hawaiians are with us, and we're taking people of the community out into the water and on the canoes, and just sharing who we are really in that form. Rather than a camp or something, do a little 3 or 4 day little journey, hopping from different spots on your islands. So thought.
I love it. I'm gonna post some resources real time on this. I just dropped something in the meeting chat. The reason I put in there's a digital story created by Chief Leshai school students about the importance of canoe journey for them. If you go to that website, you can see it's a 5-minute video created by Chief Leshai students. And the thing that's also interesting about it is it was co-created with some University of Washington students that I work with. And Bina was so generous to invite 2 of the UW students to go on canoe journey with the CLS canoe family up near Bellingham last year. And not only was it, you'll see in this video, so important for Chief Leshai students as Indigenous peoples to be part of canoe journey, but I tell you what, it completely blew my students' minds to be invited, first of all, to be part of a day pull, and then to be able to have those conversations with the CLS students about the importance of their culture and their education and canoe journey. So it's really, as Bina said, it's very powerful and very transformative. And like I was saying earlier, education in the dialogical way between students, having fun, working hard, pulling hard, Any other remarks that people want to make? I'm aware of the time. I think we just have a few more minutes before we wrap up here. Does anyone want to make any other remarks based on the class or tonight's presentation or your own thoughts about the island, about sustainability and equity? Any other comments that people want to make? Okay.
So
Well,
Patrick, if we have a couple more minutes, maybe we could
please.
ask the non-faculty just the general question of comments about Vashon 101, the format, the good, the bad, the ugly, or just anything any of our participants would like to say about the class as a whole.
I do think that's, I mean, if anybody has a remark, but also I think Elsa's going to remark about this. There's going to be a survey going out, and then maybe also an opportunity for people to say things anonymously or, ultimately be constructive. But I certainly don't mean to close this down, but I also don't want people to feel put on the spot. Like they could say this last session is really horrible and we shouldn't do this session again. You can say that in the survey, but please don't say it to me or hurt my feelings.
If I could just say one thing, Patrick, thank you. Difficult thing to pull together all the disparate strings and all the disparate strains that go into Vashon 101 and to try and pull it together and make sense out of it. You did a magnificent job. And so for me, at least, a great deal of thanks. And Binna, thank you for being here. It's just incredibly valuable to have you as part of this group.
Well, thank you all for including me in your conversation of trying to make positive environmental and social change. It's important. Just one step at a time, one person at a time, and it can happen.
Like it. Be on the ground, Bina. You're always great. I guess the one thing I'll just say is this: is it's and maybe in echoing what's said, it's really been an honor for me. I mean, I've today in preparing for talk, I got the chance to look over my notes. I took extensive notes during the class. I learned a tremendous amount sitting in on all the presentations. I really do hope people go back and mine those presentations. They're pretty remarkable, and I've learned a lot. You know, both sort of from a conceptual level about how people think of these things and how they fit the pieces together. But I've also learned some really practical things about the island, about this geology, about its ecology, about its demography and the shifts on the island. And so it's really been an eye-opening experience for me to have a chance to sit through them all and kind of try to imagine what are the different threads. And I actually see a lot of continuity in many regards. We don't all agree on all the ways and how to frame things and the next steps. But by and large, what I really am impressed by is the genuine commitment to trying to making Vashon a better place. And that's, you know, that's not easy. And we have a lot of institutions on the island that are striving to do that. But I think we're at this really interesting nexus and kind of point where I think there's a lot of, you know, maybe this isn't, I've been here for 20 years, so I haven't been here as long as some people on the island, but I kind of feel like we're in this period of time where there's a lot of frisson and a lot of positive, like, dialogue and discussion. And I think that that's the challenge that we have today is, like, as we're seeing tensions around certain issues, can we come out the other side in a better place? And I think that that's completely possible. You know, I think whether it's the environment or the treatment facility on the island that's about to be launched, whether it's, you know, other issues around affordable housing, I think that, you know, so in any case, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Elsa, for giving me the opportunity to play this role. So, and I'll pass it on to Elsa.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Patrick, for this evening, and thank you to all the speakers, to Bianca and to Bruce and to Bina, Alice, Steve, Tom, who's not here this evening, and thank you, Chris, for always helping out with these sessions. And I also want to say that we appreciate all the work that was done to create Vashon 101, this speaker series and the original Vashon 101 many years ago, and how we borrowed from that, because a lot of work went into that original Vashon 101. A survey will be sent out to all participants soon. Please participate and let us know what you'd like to see in future Vashon 101s. While this is the last Vashon 101 in the series, it's not the last museum talk for the year. In September, we will take a look at the past and the future when Bill Woodward will talk about the question, will the 2020s roar like the 1920s? And then in October, Ann Irish will join us to talk about the ferry system and Puget Sound. And in November, Christopher Bryden, I think it's Bryden, he's a language teacher from the Puyallup tribe language program. We'll talk about efforts to revitalize the Tulshutsi language. That was something that that came up several times throughout Vashon 101. We'd like to know more about the language and the Swiftwater language, and so, or the Tulshutsi language. So we'll have that happening in November. And you'll be able to sign up for all of these talks on our website at vashonheritagemuseum.org. And I just want to say thank you all very much, and please fill out the survey when you see it. Good night.